What's up everyone, it's Mark and I'm here today with another art tutorial. Now last time I was working on a canvas, it had a heart with wings and I was planning on doing a whole bunch of different videos on that painting as I worked through it, but I kind of found myself in the zone and I finished it, and I didn't really get to do a lot of tutorial work, and honestly a lot of it I was just kind of winging it, right? No pun. Here's what it looks like. Came out pretty good. And I don't have the piece, I actually gave it away. I gave it to my daughter. So moving on to something else. And today I'm doing a tutorial on how to primer either a canvas or some kind of a surface using gesso. Gesso is kind of like the universal foundation. And what I mean by that is that you can apply gesso to a surface and then you can paint on it with pretty much anything. Oil, acrylic, water-based paints, watercolor, doesn't matter. Gesso gets along with everyone. Now, I don't usually use gesso very often because it's really expensive. I primarily work with acrylics, which is a water-based paint. So therefore, I usually use house paint, exterior latex house paint. I buy it in flat finish, and I want it to be as flat as possible because it has the most tooth. It absorbs paint, not gesso, just because it's so expensive. House paint is water-based, and acrylic is water-based, you're good. If you happen to be using oil paints and you use a water-based or a latex house paint and you put oil on top, it's going to repel, your paint's going to peel off. So you got to be very careful with that. Don't want to get too technical here, but today we are using gesso, but there are going to be some tricks to using gesso to make it work. And a lot of it has to do with the tooth or the texture that ends up on your surface. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So for this particular video, I'm working on illustration board, this here. This is actually a scrap that I had left over. It's actually been in my garage for like 20 years. It's yellow and faded and doesn't matter. We're gonna prime it. Now I'm just gonna use a portion. I've got a line drawn out here. Now if you happen to be applying gesso to a canvas, this next thing's not gonna pertain to you. Just pretty much coat the whole thing. But when you're working with a paper product, whether it's an illustration board or a poster board or whatever it is, you don't wanna paint to the edges. If you paint to the edges, it's gonna cause it to bend. And then you can maybe put books on top of it, restack it, get it heavy again. But the trick that I learned was to always leave a border, and then I'm gonna tape the edges. And that allows the paint to not make it to the edges, and it makes it not curve. It'll curve a little bit, but not as much. So like I said, I drew a line on the board here, and I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna mask it out. Now gesso has to be shaken up a lot, especially if it's been sitting. This has been sitting in my garage for maybe 15 years or so, so I really got to shake it. It separates, but let's get that done. So when it comes to brushes, you want to use a large brush. I mean, this isn't the biggest that I've got. I've got huge brushes, but this is going to do for the size that I need to work with. You can use a massive brush. Just keep in mind that the bigger the brush, the more it's going to drink. In other words, it's going to soak up a lot of the paint into the bristles. So if you have a small area, use a smaller brush. That way this doesn't absorb as much. Now this isn't a new brush. If you look closely at it here, you're going to see that there's frayed ends on here, all of these little guys. And that's completely okay because this is a priming job. We're not going to get real detailed. If I was doing some kind of edge work, this would not fly. This is why I hang on to old beat up brushes for something like this. So to kind of give away the trade secret here, when you're working with gesso, you're gonna go in one direction, up and down, all the way across. You're gonna let it dry. Then you're gonna come back in and you're gonna go left to right, all the way across. If you wanna get fancy, you can go diagonal, go the other diagonal. But the point is that you don't wanna have a continuous brush like stroke that goes in one line. It's gonna create this weird texture. You want it to be smoothed out. And you're gonna work thin, not thick, and it's gonna let that build up. And that allows you to paint and not have a lot of issues later on. Now working on illustration board, it's a rather smooth surface, so it's gonna stay smooth. If you're working with a canvas, let's say, the thing about canvas is that it has a lot of tooth. Now this one was primered using house paint. This one's already done, but there is a lot of texture here. So before I start applying paint, especially in large areas, it might be beneficial for me to go in here and put a couple of more coats to smooth it out. We want the surface to be a lot smoother for detailed work. So to prep the area, I always start with just water. I'm gonna moisten the area. It doesn't matter which way I go, I'm just gonna moisten this up. And because the reason I do this is that it allows the gesso or paint to get soaked into the surface a lot easier. I learned this from watercolor painting. It's just better. Now we're ready for the gesso. I'm just gonna put it into this little container. Okay, about that much. And I'm gonna start with the up and down. First, I'm gonna soak my brush with it. Here we go. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but this paint is spreading. It's kind of spreading out like as if it was a watercolor, and that's exactly what I want. See how it's spreading right there? Just bleeding out. That's a good sign. And that's it. We don't need to apply any more paint. All I'm doing right now is going back over it and making sure my brush strokes are evenly distributed. In other words, I don't have a big lump of paint in one area. It's just nice and smoothed out. I might have to do this a couple times because right now I've got like these ribbons of white here. And again, I'm just doing this to smooth the paint out. Okay, so that's pretty smooth. And there's a little bit of a curve, but had I painted to the edges, this thing would be really curved right now. So that's why we tape the edges. We're gonna let this dry, and then we're gonna add another coat, and we're gonna go in the opposite direction. Okay, so working with the gesso as a wash, that's what we call it when we have it real thin. It dries quick. It's dried like in 15 minutes. It's probably been 30 minutes since my last coating, but we're gonna go ahead and now apply the next coating, and we're gonna go side to side. Now, I'm not gonna pre-wet this time because we've already done that. The initial was because I wanted the gesso to spread and apply a coat. Right now I'm just gonna work straight gesso on here. It's gonna take a little while longer because it's thicker. It's not gonna spread as easily. Now I am working with a pretty significant amount here. What I wanna avoid is getting this rough, sticky texture that you get sometimes. We want it to be fluid. That's why I'm using like big gobs of it. If you get that sticky texture, what will happen is it'll actually give you a bad texture to work with when you start painting. And this is why it's expensive to use gesso, because a bottle of gesso can be $20, $30, where you can buy a whole gallon of house paint for like 25 bucks. Okay, so we've got our second coating on. Just going back and forth now, long brush strokes just to kind of smooth it out. Now at this point, I can basically let it dry and be done and get started. But I want to be a little bit more meticulous. I'm going to put another layer. I'm going to go diagonal and another layer diagonal the other direction. And what that'll do is it'll eliminate any linear brush strokes. One, two, three, four coats, each in a different direction on my board. So now I've got a solid white ready to go, and it's still wet, but it has a nice woven texture to it, which will make it easy for me to paint on it when I start the actual painting. So again, this is how you prime something regardless of the surface. And again, if you're working with a board, illustration board, bristle board, even canvas paper, you want to leave a border along the edges so it doesn't curl. Good luck.